Hello and welcome to episode 221 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and deputy director here at the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, but not with me this week, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody. Bill is currently the face of, or one of the faces of the sunken submersible that was out looking after the Titanic. Bill is doing live news segments all day today and unfortunately can't be with us, but we have our ever faithful co-host, and my often wingman, historian Jon Parshall. Jon, good to have you as always. Thanks for being here.
Love it. Gonna do our back-to-back doubleheader today.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. And we got a pretty cool topic we're going to talk about today that is an influencer on a lot that happens for the rest of the war. On November 1st, 1943, Admiral William Halsey's forces surprised the Japanese, and I do mean surprised the Japanese, when they made a full-scale landing at Cape Torquay on Bougainville. Expecting an American landing, but not expecting it at that location, the Japanese were stunned when the Marines of the 3rd Division waded ashore and pushed inland. Responding to the threat, the Japanese sent a surface force to destroy the Allied transports offshore that night, but in turn were destroyed themselves in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. Japanese Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet Koga Minichi responded to the action off Empress Augusta by shuttling a strong force of heavy cruisers to Rabaul in preparation for another strike at the Americans offshore on Bougainville. Allied intelligence told Admiral William Halsey that the Japanese were building surface units in Rabaul and anticipated the counterstrike, cussing over his lack of potent surface vessels to respond to any Japanese threat. Halsey decided to send his carrier task group to raid Rabaul and hopefully knock out the threat staring him in the face before that threat smacked him in the mouth. With that decision in his mind, Halsey ordered the venerable old USS Saratoga and the new light carrier Princeton to attack the fortress of Rabaul. An additional strike a couple days later would augment the initial strike and would see the introduction of the ships that would carry the war all the way to Tokyo Bay. In all, these events are lumped together and known as the carrier raids on Rabaul. Jon, this is not some piecemeal operation, is it?
Yeah, no, this is a kind of an interesting inflection point in the war as a whole, I think, in that the ability of carrier forces to really bring the war against powerful Japanese bases was sort of an unknown. You got the same sort of thing manifesting with respect to truck up in the Carolines, that up to this point in the war, both Rabaul and truck have got these sort of outsized reputations as this is scary, man. We don't want to go anywhere near those places because they are just absolutely chock-a-block with Japanese defenders and aircraft and the whole schmear.
Yeah, and Rabaul is certainly it holds that place in the American mindset, and we'll get to that and why here in just a second. But let's talk about Rabaul before we get to the raid. Prior to the Japanese invasion of Rabaul, Rabaul was actually on the list of Allied bases. Simpson Harbor, we've mentioned it when we've done previous episodes, specifically on Guadalcanal. We've talked about Rabaul a lot. And Simpson Harbor is very akin to Pearl Harbor and is this beautiful, natural, deep water port, right?
Yeah, it's one of the premier anchorages in the entire Pacific Ocean. It's a big body of water, nicely protected in that the inlet into the bay can be easily controlled if it's your port. And so, yeah, this was a bay that both sides recognized could be a very valuable anchorage if they could get a hold of it and keep it.
Yeah, and to that end, the Japanese saw it as a much more desirable location than did the Australians that were actually there initially. The Australians simply, it's not that they didn't want to keep it, they just didn't have the guys to do it. When the Japanese take Rabaul in 42, which is it 40? Yeah, January 14th, 1942, consider the war situation at that point.
Right. Yeah. Taking Rabaul was all part of what we would call, the octopus or the centrifugal offensive. Rabaul had been slated in to the much larger Japanese plan of campaign, which was rolling south from around the Philippines. Frankly, the logistical hub was Davao, the city of Davao on Mindanao in the Philippines. And from that port, all of these forces were streaming into the southern resource area, aiming themselves at Java. But one of the sort of the side campaigns that happens during that initial offensive in the January, February timeframe is a force of Japanese basically goes along the northern coast of New Guinea and plucks off a number of the places like Wewak and so forth there. And then at the same time, the Japanese come down, raid Rabaul, and capture it.
Mm-hmm. And the Australians pulled out the majority of their people before the Japanese came there, but there are about 1,000 Aussies that are captured by the Japanese.
Yeah,
when they take Rabaul, and these guys, as we know, and we're going to do an episode separately on prisoners of the Japanese. These guys face a very harsh lifestyle. Those who are fortunate enough to survive. So following the capture of Rabaul, the Japanese, John, they pour resources into this area.
Yeah, as I say in my book manuscript, the Japanese view Rabaul as sort of the perfect little fixer-upper. And at this point in the war, it could be had for a song, and they took it. And very quickly, it becomes the linchpin of everything that they are doing down in this neck of the woods. And by the time this war ends, and even by now, and when I say now, I'm talking, end of 42 and middle part of 43, there's 100,000 Japanese service personnel in Rabaul. And that is Navy personnel, Army. Rabaul is the headquarters of two separate armies, 17th and 18th Army at one point. And then there's 8th Area Army is riding herd on those two armies themselves. So there's a lot of Army personnel here. There are, I believe, 5 airfields in the immediate vicinity, two of which, Guadalcanal and Rapopo, both have concrete runways, which is completely unheard of in this neck of the woods. I can't remember off the top of my head if Port Moresby has a concrete runway or not. I think I'm not sure, but even if Moresby does, I mean, there aren't a lot of concrete runways. There may not be another concrete runway within 1,000 miles of this place until you get up to Truck. So
the only one I could think of would be at Munda, is when they were building Munda Field in New Georgia. That's it.
Right. So it's just a warren. It's got a lot of logistical facilities that have been built in the town of Rabaul itself. It's got a lot of tunnels and whatnot. This is it's not a base, as I say. It's a complex of airfields, facilities, the whole schmear. It's a big deal.
So the likening it of Rabaul to Pearl Harbor is not a stretch at all.
Not that much of a stretch. I mean, it's not in the same league, obviously, as Pearl Harbor, but it's kind of the same breed of cat. It's a very formidable obstacle. It has, at any given time, it's going to have 100+ aircraft there, a lot of anti-aircraft guns, over 300 anti-aircraft guns, which are manned by both Army and Navy personnel. And in one of the sort of rare instances of inter-service cooperation between the Japanese Army and Navy, they've actually fairly rationally allocated how the anti-aircraft guns on this island are going to be divided up. And okay, I'm going to watch over this airfield. You've got control over the airspace over the town, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very formidable objective.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so formidable that the entire Southwest Pacific operations of Admiral Halsey, in combination with MacArthur, are focused on cutting this sucker off.
Yeah, Operation
Cartwheel. Yeah, exactly. Cartwheel is the entire thing is set about to cut this Rabaul fortress, which is what it is, off. So the invasion of New Georgia is to establish airfields to further leapfrog up. Bougainville is directly related to the capture of Rabaul, or not the capture, but the neutering of Rabaul.
Yeah, isolation and neutralization. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right.
So Allied air forces had been attacking Rabaul for months. These were not carrier forces. These are General Kenny, who is, we've gone on and on about him. He's the man. This is Kenny's forces. The 5th Air Force are attacking Rabaul with, heavy bombers when they can, fighters, 38s generally when they can. The Australians are attacking Rabaul when they can. So, well, then I don't believe the New Zealanders are, because they don't have the range. Maybe you can correct me on that. But regardless,
no, yeah.
Regardless, that Rabaul is under not constant but fairly consistent air attack. Kenny's 5th Air Force, to that point, they'd been bombing Rabaul randomly here and there whenever they could get out there since October. Weather, technical issues, and supplies caused the bombing campaign to be less than frequent than desired. And the results, frankly, honestly, with the exception of the whittling down of the fighter forces, had been less than stellar. So, the attempt was made to knock out Rabaul's anti-aircraft forces that you were talking about, knock out the runways and the airfield all over. But they hadn't done that. Kenny's people just had not done that.
Well, and that speaks to just the incredible difficulty of actually knocking out an airfield. I mean, people have this mental image, I think, in many cases of, oh, well, you just go and you bomb it, and you put craters in the runway, and then, it's out of business. It's like, no. Actually, airfields are relatively resilient. And if you have taken the time to do things like build individual aircraft revetments for all of the planes so they can be dispersed and semi-enclosed, they become very difficult targets to take out. It's pretty easy to protect your aircraft. It's easy to fill in those runways after a bombing attack and get that base up and running again. And 2, if you've got a concrete runway, that is a very resilient target and difficult to knock out. So the fact that, you've got not one but 2 different airfields here with concrete runways and other, dispersion fields as well. Okay, maybe I have a good raid today and I'm able to knock one of those fields out temporarily, but the Japanese still have 4 other airfields in the area. Mm-hmm. It makes it's a multi-headed monster. You can't kill it all at once.
Right. And then on top of that, you got this absolutely perfect natural harbor with its multi-rings of defense that if there were surface forces, warships I'm talking about, or cargo ships that are to get into this harbor, which, as we have seen over the process of many of these episodes, there's almost always shipping in Rabaul. Yeah. They're going to be well defended. So, and that's it's kind of staring the Allies in the face at this point, is this beast that they can't seem to kill.
Right. I will say, as far as the Japanese are concerned, this is not seen as a plum assignment in being stationed to Rabaul either. We've just gotten done talking about the Aleutians and how that was not seen as a great place to serve. Rabaul likewise is not, because the reason that that harbor is so beautiful is it is the caldera of an active volcano. And there are 2 active volcanoes on either side of the harbor. Both of which had erupted in 1937 and absolutely flattened the town. And they will go on again. I believe it's in 2009. Rabaul gets flattened again by these same volcanoes. So, okay, great. It's a lovely harbor, but I'm also, snuggling up to a volcano, one of which is active and is always, fumarating and doing its thing. So there's volcanic ash all over the place, and the air quality is pretty wretched, and yada yada yada. It's not a complete garden spot, I guess I would say. But yeah.
So as the Americans land at Bougainville in November, on November 1st, exactly, Allied aircraft, specifically strafers and P-38s from Kenny's 5th Air Force, attacked Rabaul the following day on November the 2nd. And this is what's known as Black Tuesday in the history of the 5th Air Force. This is an operation that, as we'll see here in just a second, is talked about being this massive success, but in reality is literally the farthest thing from that. Kenny sends 9 squadrons of B-25s, 72 aircraft altogether, escorted by 80-ish P-38s to attack Simpson Harbor. 8 B-25s were lost and 9 P-38s, and about 50 guys were lost in this raid that Kenny called, as I said, Black Tuesday. Yeah. Despite the losses, Kenny and MacArthur lauded the November 2nd raid, calling it a decisive defeat of the Japanese fortress of Rabaul.
That's my man MacArthur,
Yeah.
how to spin a press release on something that is actually not all that spectacular and turn it into, the second coming of Christ. So yeah, he was sorry, that just popped out.
That's fine.
Yeah,
but it's true though, because
yeah,
look at the results of the raid. So in reality, the Japanese literally completely shrugged off the raid. They were like, yeah, get off my shoulder.
right.
Japanese sources saying that only 18 of their aircraft were destroyed as compared to the 90 that were claimed by General Kenny,
Right.
while one subchaser and 2 merchant ships were sunk. So,
right.
As we've said 100 times, any loss of life is significant. However, this is nothing compared to what was actually, stated by the press. And General Kenny, for all his good points, this is not one of his finer points.
One of them. I'm just doing the math here real quick on. Meanwhile, there's the American casualties, right? So we lose 17 aircraft out of those 152 that get committed. So this is an 11% attrition rate for this particular raid. You can't keep that kind of stuff up. I mean, that's an awful exchange rate that we've just had to pay.
It is, and I think we need to put this in perspective. In that, people are going to say, "Well, it's only 11%." Yeah, and 11% for the 8th Air Force would be like, "Yeah, that's not bad." This is the 5th Air Force.
Right.
They're not getting the supply chain that the 8th and the 9th Air Forces are getting. They're getting the scraps. They're getting the leftovers in the fridge is what they're getting. So anything that they lose is a significant loss, not just because it's human lives, but because of that machine that they might not have it to replace.
Yeah. Yeah. So, even for 8th Air Force, this would be a significant punch in the chin. And one of the things that makes air combat sort of different from ground combat is when we think about ground combat, we often think in terms of significant clashes, big battles. You get a big battle, a lot of casualties happen, but then, there's not a lot of activity until the next big battle. Air combat is different. Air combat, these guys are going up every day in some cases, or every other day, every third day. There's this constant drumbeat of attritional combat happening in the air. And if you run the math on a force that even takes something that sounds trivial, like 3 or 4% casualties, and compile the cumulative attritional rate over the course of like 6 months' time, you realize that, man, even if I take that low level of individual raids only giving up 3-4% casualties, I come out of the end of the pipeline of 6 months with only half of my force left. So 11%, that is a real hit in the schnoz as far as Kenny's Air Force is concerned. This is a bad day.
It is indeed, and it just shows how tough of a nut Rabaul is to crack. I mean, the anti-aircraft forces are anti-aircraft that is arrayed around the base itself would be formidable in Europe.
Yeah,
much less here. I mean, you're over 300 and some odd anti-aircraft weapons of varying sizes, most of which are plane killers. These aren't 20 millimeters. These are some powerful weapons that are up there that can throw a lot of lead.
Yeah, I don't know the exact composition. I would speculate to say that you would find a lot of the Navy's older 4.7 inch, the 120 millimeter mounts there, but there's also going to be a lot of 25 millimeter. You just find that all over the Pacific when you go to places like Saipan or Peleliu. That gun is endemic to Japanese fortifications, and it's not the greatest. It's not the greatest light AA in the world, but yeah, if you got several hundred of them that you have to go through, it's problematic.
Yeah, this is significant stuff. So after Admiral Omori, who we hear about literally one time and then never hear about him again, his abrupt failure at Empress Augusta Bay to destroy the Allied transport fleet that is tanked off of Cape Torquemada, which, by the way, Omori was relieved after this failure. Admiral Koga decides that he's got to send something bigger out there. He's sitting there at truck, and he's like, you know what? I'm not going to sit a penny any force down there. We're going to go down there and punch these guys in the mouth and end this crap right now. He sends a powerful force down, that Koga does, a powerful force down to Rabaul to fuel up and then go down there and kick that ass, doesn't he?
Yeah, pretty much. These are the group that he sends down there are the most modern heavy cruisers in the Japanese inventory. And the contrast here between the force that Koga is sending and the force that Admiral Mikawa used at the Battle of Sabo Island, that was very much, maybe the C team. Those were some of the oldest cruisers in the Japanese inventory, and he absolutely mopped the floor with Turner and Crutchley's force that night. This group that's going down there includes all 4 of the Otago class heavy cruisers, 2 of the remaining 3 Mikuma class, which are slightly newer, and then 1 of the 2 Tone class, the Chikuma, which is one of the 2 newest cruisers in the Japanese inventory. So these are extremely powerful, capable warships, and not the kind of thing that, if you're a surface action group off of Bougainville, you don't want to be tangling with these guys, not at night.
No, and to that point, if you've watched our episode on Bougainville, you know that Halsey doesn't have much of a surface force around. There are what's the forces that engage the Japanese at Empress Augusta Bay, but they're back refueling and replenishing ammunition right now, so they're not even on scene. They can't get out there. Theoretically, they couldn't get out there in time to deal with this. And if you recall, we had said that before Bougainville, Halsey was bitching, for lack of a better term, to Nimitz, saying, "I need heavier forces here. All I got are these light cruisers, Cleveland class cruisers, which are fantastic vessels, but they can't go toe to toe with a heavier Japanese vessel and expect to survive." At least that's what Halsey thought. Yeah. So his premonition of "I need heavier surface forces" actually does come to fruition here.
Yes.
And he starts to sweat some bullets. So at this stage in the invasion, Halsey was actually unaware of the sortie of the Japanese forces or their intentions. Halsey's focus was on 2 things at this juncture. 1 was Bougainville, obviously, and 2, his depleted forces. As I had just mentioned, he had been ordered to send what remained of his surface forces. A lot of them were refueling and replenishing. Admiral Merrill's people, most of the Cleveland-class cruisers, were ordered to be sent up to Nimitz's forces that were starting to come together for the operation at Tarawa, Operation Galvanic. Admiral Merrill's Task Force 39, which included the cruiser like Montpelier and ships like that, were gone. They were already gone. They were plowing north trying to get to Pearl Harbor to get with Nimitz's people as they were starting to, or Spruance's people were actually, as they were starting to make their push westwards towards Tarawa Atoll.
Meaning, so this beachhead is naked.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, he's got a few DDs, but that's not going to do anything to these guys.
Right.
So all he really has, he being Halsey, as at his disposal are 2 aircraft carriers. Now, we've talked, ad nauseum about the aircraft carriers off Guadalcanal. And, at one point, of course, there was only Hornet, and at another point, there was only Enterprise. So having 2 carriers for Halsey would have been, like at Guadalcanal would have been serious stuff. But at this stage in the war, 2 carriers is, and considering the carriers that are here, and we're gonna bring their reputations to light here, but the 2 ships that he had at his stage was the brand new USS Princeton, which I know you have an affinity for, and the other one was the Old Lady. She was at this time the oldest aircraft carrier in the United States fleet. She hadn't seen combat in over a year, and thus far had taken part in only 1 battle, that being Eastern Solomons, and had spent the vast majority of the war sucking up torpedoes and spending time in the yard. That, of course, is USS Saratoga.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to mention the same thing. She really did have a nasty habit of running across submarines that would want to put one
Yeah.
fish into her, and send her back to the yard. So yeah,
Yeah.
she was kind of star-crossed up to this point in the war, and her glamorous sister Lexington, of course, went down in the first carrier battle. And yeah, Sarah has not exactly upheld the family reputation up to
No.
this point, unfortunately.
No, she does pretty good at or her
She
air
does.
group does pretty good at Eastern Solomons. And to her credit, that's really her only crack at a carrier battle
Right.
is Eastern Solomons, because she's always friggin' damaged. She's a torpedo magnet,
Right.
and it's just she's always a
Yep.
day late and $1 short every
Yeah.
single time.
Yeah.
So to put her in perspective, she's the Navy's third aircraft carrier. She was actually laid down before Lex, but Lex was commissioned first, CV2, CV3, she is huge, man. She's 880 feet long. Yeah, massive. Just big by today's standards.
Yeah. Yeah.
She had 16 boilers that fed 4 turbine generators, which spun 8 electric motors that produced over 2,000 horsepower. So she could cook, and she could make over 30 knots. Yeah.
Yeah.
She could move.
Yeah, they're both big, fast ships. I forget which one of the two of those. Wasn't there an episode sometime in the 30s that there had been I can't remember what was going on, but one of the West Coast cities lost power, and they sent one of these two ships. Yeah, and they basically Tacoma. That's right.
Yep.
And
it was Lexington.
It was Lexington, right? And basically, put this turbo electric ship and kind of plugged it into the power grid, and it ran Tacoma's electrical grid for a while. You have a friend behind you, I see.
I do, yes. My dog is here. Gunther, the German Shepherd, is standing right here.
My man, Gunther.
Decided to bring him to work today.
Excellent. That's excellent.
So Halsey has a bloodline with Saratoga, shall we say. In 1935, from 1935 to 1937, then Captain William Halsey was skipper of USS Saratoga. So Sarah has a very long and storied history within the United States Navy until World War II, frankly. And she just, as you said, star-crossed.
Yeah, just never got the opportunity. Yeah, she and Lexington are really the two flight decks upon which the U.S. Navy built all of its carrier doctrine pre-war. There's sort of the analogs to Kaga and Akagi. It's those two flight decks for the Japanese they're of similar ages and similar lineages. Akagi was a converted battle cruiser, just like Lexington and Saratoga are.
So because of Sarah's star-crossed war career to this point, she had earned a couple of derogatory nicknames, one of which was the Reluctant Dragon, which is frankly unfair.
That's really uncool. Right.
It really is. And the Sarah Maru. By most accounts, too, she was not a happy ship. I knew a couple of guys who flew from her flight deck that had crossed deck from Enterprise specifically and flown off of Saratoga during Guadalcanal. And they hated the damn thing. It was they called it a scow. It had slow elevators.
Yes,
the ship could move,
but elevators,
everything inside. Yeah.
No, and to that point, I have heard the same things, that Saratoga's approach to doing deck operations was very different than the Yorktown and certainly the Essex class carriers, because the elevators were so slow. You ended up having to do a lot of your stuff like right up on the flight deck. That once the plane was on the flight deck, it ain't leaving. Until we're going to gas it up there, we're going to bomb it up there, and then get it off, because the elevator cycles were just so miserable on the damn thing that you couldn't do it any other way.
All right, exactly. And it was not a post that people want. It was not a ship that people wanted to be posted to.
Yeah.
Just put it that way.
Yeah.
On July 26, 1943, Saratoga and the rest of Task Force 36, soon to be reclassified as Task Force 38, they get a new commander. You talked about Lexington. This guy is Rear Admiral Ted Sherman. Ted Sherman, of course, was former skipper of USS Lexington at Coral Sea.
Right.
So Sherman is known to be a very aggressive commander. He's known to be a risk taker. He's known to be, as my friend Jig Dog Ramage called a fire eater. He's a guy that is going to get in there and just make things happen.
Right.
So for all the time that Sarah's spending in port, Sherman comes aboard, and the people in the know who Sherman is, and they're like, maybe things are going to turn around and we're going to actually see some action, because this dude doesn't mess around. And they're not putting him here just to put him here. They're putting him here for a reason.
Right.
That is exactly what happens here. So not long after that, Sarah receives a new air group 12, under the command of Commander Howard Caldwell. We'll hear about him in a minute. Caldwell's fighter squadron flew the brand new F-6F Hellcat. And by brand new, I mean brand new. I mean, it was one of the first air groups to be equipped, not the first, but one of the first to be equipped with the new hot fighter. Let's talk about USS Princeton, John. This is one of your favorite old gals here.
Just, and it goes back to the fact that there was a book by Edwin P. Hoyt called Death of the Princeton that I read as a school kid. I was probably 12 or 13 when I read this thing, and I read it probably 12 or 13 times, as one does when one is that age. I love all the Independence class light carriers. I just think that they were, they didn't carry the biggest air groups. You're talking, 40 to 45 aircraft on these things, but they were fast, handy ships, capable. It's basically, we had taken a group of light cruisers and decided to convert them into light carriers. And so the analog here from the Japanese standpoint, these are kind of bigger cousins of carriers like Shoho or Zuiho. Shoho and Zuiho both, I think, were extremely useful vessels, even though they were conversions from seaplane carriers. Fast, handy, good ships. And the Independence carriers are the same breed of cat. They can keep up with a fast carrier task force. They have a big enough air group to be interesting and to be able to do interesting things. And so the fact that these 9 ships kind of come into the mix at the same time that some of the newer Essex class, particularly as you mentioned, Essex and Bunker Hill are really the first two that are in the mix in a serious way. They come in at the same time that those new Essex class carriers do, and some of them, put together a pretty credible reputation as warships, and Princeton is one of them.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful point. And that, when you think of the fast carrier force, the big blue fleet that roams across the Pacific and just crushes everything in its way, you think of the Essex class carriers, and you think of Enterprise because she was with them too. You don't think of the light carriers, the Princeton class, but they were there because they could clip along at over 30 knots. They could keep up with these big girls, and they did play a vital part. One of the more interesting parts and vital parts, at least in the forms of the Marine Corps, is concerned, is that a lot of these escort carriers, light carriers, performed a lot of close air support as the war started to drag on. Right. So you see a lot of these carriers perform a lot of, they're involved in a lot of amphibious operations. They're detached from the fast carrier task force, and they're sent to go assist, and then they rejoin the fast carrier. So, I mean, these things are utilitarian, to say the least.
Absolutely. No, if we fast forward to the Battle of Philippine Sea, and if you look at the composition of the 4 carrier task forces that are going to be involved in that battle, every one of them is composed of usually 3 ships, sometimes 4, and there will always be a mix of, 1 or 2 Independence and an Essex, or 2 Essexes and an Independence. Again, the fact that they had the horsepower and the speed to keep up with the fast battleships and the other fast carriers made them incredibly useful vessels.
The only difference, aside from size, obviously, with the fleet carriers is the composition of their air groups. Yeah. Because of their size, they couldn't carry the whole gamut of fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. They generally carried just Avengers and F-6Fs. Some escort carriers later on in the war will carry the FM-2 Wildcat, which was a souped up F-4F. Regardless, they're only going to carry fighters, and they're going to carry Avengers, which are both handy aircraft to have when you're plopping along through Japanese-held islands. That's, aside from that and the size, that's really the only difference in the two classifications of ships, because they both play these vital roles throughout the war.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things you see with a big fleet carrier is you get certain scale economies that, because I can put 100 aircraft on this thing, I have the real estate on the deck and within the hangars to actually devote to 3 separate communities, if you will, torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters. In a smaller carrier like Independence class, you don't have those scale economies, and so you have to focus on 1 or 2 things that you can do reasonably well. And in the case of these vessels, it's mostly fighters.
Yep. So Allied aerial reconnaissance of the area around Rabaul was hit or miss at this point. Not to say that it was bad, not to say that it was good. Some days it was good, some days it was bad, just depending on who was flying and the weather. Good luck at this point was often not on the Allied side when it came in terms of spotting stuff. It's just the way the fog of war, the fortunes of war, as they say. However, on November the 3rd, a B-24 Liberator piloted by a gentleman named Lieutenant Robert Silvernail spotted Admiral Kurita's cruiser force inbound for Rabaul as the force neared St. George Channel. Kurita's force at once detected Silvernail's lumbering B-24 Liberator up at altitude and started popping shots off at it, sending scout planes to go shoot it down. But Silvernail kept bobbing in and out of clouds and hung with Kurita's force for about 2 hours, I believe it was. Well so, done. I mean, he's just hanging there. Yeah, he's hanging there like a fly, just hanging out. Silvernail sends a report in of this sighting of Admiral Kurita's cruiser force that Koga sends down there. And this sends shock waves through Admiral William F. Halsey.
Yeah.
He literally said at one point, quote, "This was the most desperate emergency confronted me in my entire time as COMSOPAC," unquote. And that is a statement and a half.
Think about that. Yeah. The fact that, we've gone through the episodes around Guadalcanal, and we know how harrowing particularly the middle of November at Guadalcanal was, that we've gotten down to the point where we're going to commit our last 2 fast battleships to go down and fight a surface action in a bathtub, and this particular instance where he's now facing down the barrel of 7 modern Japanese heavy cruisers, he ranks as higher on the stressometer than that particular affair. That really is saying something.
And when you think about it, that's a beautiful point, because you got to think, we always talk about Guadalcanal and, the commitment of Washington and Sodak to that fight was A, ballsy, and B, he is pressed against the wall, yet this is making him sweat bullets more than that. That is saying something about A, Halsey and his perception of the Japanese, B, the Allied situation at the time, which we just said, is bereft of any kind of serious surface forces to fight the Japanese that are coming down here.
Right.
So to that end, Halsey knows that if the Japanese get into Rabaul and refuel and come out, they are going to just clean house off the shores of Bougainville. Yeah, they're going to just blow anything away. He's also not stupid that he knows a Japanese counter landing is going to be in the offset once these cruisers come in there and just waylay anything offshore. So he knows that he's got to do something to stop this force from coming here. And as we already said, he doesn't have anything with really to do that. And the Army Air Forces can go over there and maybe raid Rabaul, but we already know that high altitude strategic straight level bombing doesn't hit ships very often.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And you could hope to pull off a sort of a repeat of Bismarck Sea and send your B-25 strafers into that harbor, but given that threat environment and the amount of anti-aircraft weapons that are lining that harbor, that is an extremely difficult proposition. Is kind of what it comes down to. Yeah,
and not just the harbor, but the anti-aircraft weapons on the ships themselves. So I mean. Yeah, there's a lot of lead going to be coming up in the air.
Yeah, I think that it was one thing to pick on a convoy in the open ocean that was guarded by 8 destroyers. It's an entirely different thing to go after a powerful enemy naval force inside a heavily protected anchorage.
Yeah. Two totally different situations here.
Animals, yeah.
So Halsey's operations officer, a gentleman we've never talked about here before, but this guy was friggin' brilliant, named Captain Harry Thurber. Thurber presented the admiral with an alternative. He says, okay, look, I know we don't have anything to go in there and basically withstand this force if it comes at us. However, what you do have, Admiral, are 2 aircraft carriers, Saratoga and Princeton. And they will be, if we tell them now, they will be within strike range, hopefully before these cruisers leave Simpson Harbor. So Thurber presumed that the Japanese would enter Simpson Harbor just before or shortly after dawn, refuel, and get underway for the beaches that very afternoon. The time to strike was just after dawn, and hopefully the aircraft would catch the cruisers in port, refueling, and hopefully at ease. Great plan.
Yeah.
But it's like down to the minute here. Presented with Thurber's plan, Halsey studied it briefly, considered the fact that his only son, and this, I don't care who you are, Admiral or not, this plays a role in your decision-making no matter what. His only son, Bill Halsey Jr., is aboard the USS Saratoga. He looked at Thurber and replied in typical Halsey fashion, quote, "Let her go," unquote.
Got to do what you got to do. And again,
yeah, you do.
This is a guy who has never been shy about accepting the odds if that's what needs to happen in order to make the larger operation come to fruition. He knows that it's his job to protect that beachhead off of Bougainville, and he's got to do whatever he can to forestall this blow. And so if these are the only assets I've got in the neighborhood, let's put together some sort of an operational plan to get them in a position where they can hit the enemy before they come and hit us. Ballsy.
Yeah. And ballsy Halsey. But yeah. And you can't make light of the decision, that, oh, he's just sending these carriers out there. Think about this for a second. I want the viewers and listeners to think about this for a second. This is it. This is all he has are these 2 ships. Well, yeah, they're escorts, blah. But this is really his only offensive striking power, Sarah and Princeton, and that is it. And he is not, in the dark as to the Japanese are more than likely going to send a counterstrike out there, and they very likely could catch one or both, and at the very least damage, if not sink, these vessels because of the sheer amount of air power that is on and around Rabaul. So This is not an easy decision he makes here.
Yeah. Although and this actually brings up, though, a point of innovation on this operational plan is that one of the twists that they put into this is that, okay, we're going to use our carriers to deliver the strike against Rabaul, but we're going to use our own air-based assets, fighters, further down the Solomon's chain to put air cover over these 2 carriers. To protect them so that they can devote both of their air groups strictly to attack missions aimed at Rabaul. And so that I think is a key innovation and probably one that helps even the odds a little bit as far as Halsey is concerned.
And it's not just land-based aircraft. It is land-based aircraft, but it's not just your standard land-based aircraft. One of the squadrons that's orbiting as combat air patrol over the carriers, as we're going to see in just a few minutes, is VF-17, the Jolly Rogers. This is a Navy fighter squadron. They're flying F-4U Corsairs. They have to reinstall their tail hooks so they can land on these carriers.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So they had their tail hooks removed because it's like, what the hell do you need a tail hook for when you're on an island?
Right.
They have their ground crew reinstall their hooks. So if they have to land and refuel, which they do, they can. And they're qualified carrier aviators. It's brilliant, really, when you think about it, that Halsey specifically says, I want VF-17 to be combat air patrol. So if they got to land, they got a place to land.
Right.
It's brilliant. It really is. So he sends, Sarah and Princeton had just finished refueling when they get word, when Sherman gets the word to move on or after the November 4th. His orders to Sherman are vintage Halsey. And again, I'm going to read this verbatim. Quote, move Task Force 38 at all possible speed to a position south of Bougainville, where Saratoga and Princeton will launch a strike against Rabaul at first light. Priority targets are cruisers, destroyers second, period. Unquote. That's it.
Right. Yeah. Well, you want your subordinate commanders to have as much room to exercise their personal initiative as possible. He's made his intentions clear here. You know what you're supposed to do. Yikes.
Make it happen, man.
You gotta wonder the reaction of Sherman on the bridge of Saratoga when he gets that particular order. Say what? Where are we going again? Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So after working out the logistics, Sherman and his staff, or Sherman orders all ships all ahead flank, and proceeded to pound out 500 miles in 15 hours at 27 knots. So again, we talked about Saratoga and being able to haul ass. Yeah. Princeton can keep up with her. At one point, Saratoga had to slow down because she was outrunning her destroyer screen.
Yeah, which big carriers can do and can still do. You talk to any modern sailor and they'll tell you the fastest thing on the ocean is a nuclear powered aircraft carrier. They can outrun anything. They're just tremendously fast. And because they're so large, they have the sea keeping capabilities to just plow through seas that a smaller escort has real problems with.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening here. Saratoga is just booking going through that water. She's showing the U.S. Navy how fast she can actually move here. She is just getting down. So you got to feel for the squadron COs and the CAG on both ships here, because these guys had no expectations that they were going to perform an operation within 24 hours, much less Rabaul, for Christ's sakes.
Yeah. And so it's important to recognize there that, again, much like Truck, Rabaul has an outsized evil reputation within the U.S. Navy at this point. Everybody knows that you're really going into the bear cave if you were going to, pull off a raid against this particular complex of bases.
Yeah. So needless to say, few people slept that night. Certainly not the air crews, I would venture to say. Yeah. So Sherman gets on the PA on Saratoga and he says these words very exactly, quote, boys, we are hitting Rabaul tomorrow morning. This is a hell of a tough assignment. You have damn little time. God bless you, boys. Quote.
You have damn little time. Yeah. Those are happy words to go to sleep by now, aren't they?
Yeah.
You're spending your last night on Earth is going to be tonight. I don't know that
not the most inspiring speech.
Yeah, exactly. Oh well.
But he's calling a spade. I mean, he's saying, hey, look, this is the cards we have been dealt, and we're going to execute this mission. It is going to suck. But we're going to get it done, and you guys are going to be the one to do it. So, sleep well, boys, and we'll see you in the morning.
Right. Steak and eggs for everybody.
Oh, you know it.
Yeah.
So they are flying down there all night long. No, not flying. The ships are steaming like mad all night long. The air crews and the Airedales are working all night to prep the birds. They're fueling them. They're arming them. They're getting them ready to go. There's very little maps that the Navy has, that these carrier pilots have for Rabaul. So they're actually kind of doing this kind of half-assed, frankly. They're trying to work out the logistics of this strike. By 0700 the next morning, Saratoga and Princeton had reached what they called a desirable launch location. Right on schedule. Captain Harry Thurber was 100% right. Right on schedule, Kurita's cruiser force slid into Simpson Harbor at dawn on November the 5th. Cruisers dropped anchor and began refuel jamming Simpson Harbor with 7 cruisers and some 40-odd auxiliary ships. That's not all that was with them, but that was all that was in the harbor.
Yeah, and there's always ships here, as you mentioned previously. Yeah, this is a very busy harbor.
Mm-hmm. So, John, the Japanese actually spot Sherman's people coming in, don't they?
I believe that is correct. Yeah, as a matter of fact. But they misidentify him. and don't believe that it's actually a carrier aviation force. They think it's a surface action group or some sort of a mixed amphibious group. And so here is a missed opportunity on the part of the Japanese. They could have been a little more prepared for this raid than they actually were. But again, we've seen this all through the Solomons campaign. Again, if we go back to the Battle of Savo Island and the initial identification of Mikawa's cruiser force coming down the slot, and oh yeah, it's got seaplane tenders in it, so it can't possibly be a surface action group, and we don't have to worry about it. Same thing here. The Japanese are saying, oh well, it doesn't have any carriers, so it can't really do anything to us now, can it? And the result is that their air defenses are not at the level of alertness that they should be.
Exactly. So beginning at 07, American aircraft launched and formed up. Saratoga launches a full deck load, 71 aircraft, a mixed bag of SPDs, TBS, and F6Fs. She literally sends, if it has wings and the engine starts, this is going up in the air.
Yeah.
Princeton is no different. She sends literally every single thing that can start is in the air. This is a really cool little fact that I found when I was digging through prepping for this episode. So Princeton's strike was led by VF-23. This is her composite air group. Her fighter squadron is VF-23. Its commanding officer is a guy named Lieutenant Commander Henry Miller. In 1942, Hank Miller, he had been temporarily assigned to Eglin Field. He was the guy that trained the Doolittle Raiders how to take off of a carrier deck.
That's cool.
Which is kind of cool, Yeah, it really is. It's totally cool. So this is his first real introduction into combat. Obviously, he had a heavy hand in the Doolittle raid in 1942. And this is an interesting little tidbit, little side note that he's the guy that's leading Princeton's fighters into the carrier strike on Rabaul.
Right.
So Thurber's plan that we talked about before, it works perfectly. The American strikers pop up over Simpson Harbor as the 6 cruisers are moored peacefully for the day. These guys are totally not expecting any kind of American air raid.
Yeah.
They're refueling. They're eating chow. They're
eating breakfast. Yep. Yeah.
Doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah. It's kind of Pearl Harbor in reverse in a sense. You've got a fleet that should be at a little more of a wartime footing, but they figure they're safe inside this harbor. It's been a bastion for them throughout the war. And yeah, they are not at action stations when, Merry Christmas, here comes the strike force right over the harbor.
Right. So overall strike commander for both groups, Sarah and Princeton, is the gentleman that we mentioned before. This is Commander Howard H. Caldwell from Saratoga. He's aloft in a TBF Avenger with several crewmen inside, orbiting at 10,000 feet above the harbor. He's observing and radio instructions to the flock below. Inside his Avenger were the radioman, the gunner, and a photographer's mate named Paul Barnett. And Barnett is an interesting dude. Now, he was not a rated aviation radioman, radioman gunner, nothing like that. He was a photographer's mate aboard Saratoga. He literally begged Caldwell to go on this mission, convincing Caldwell. He said, look, if you take me with you, A, I want to see some combat. B, I will take photographs of this event that will A, be for history, but B, more importantly, will be used for intel. And I've got the camera equipment and the skills to do so. Reluctantly, Caldwell's like, all right, fine. Yeah. So most of the photographs we see of this event were taken by this guy, Barnett.
Right. And there are some spectacular photos out of this raid. Yeah,
they really are.
Yeah.
They really are. So as the strike appears over the harbor, Japanese fighters, needless to say, scramble. They get very little warning at all that American aircraft are inbound, and when they do get warning,
I think they had a radar set there, and I'm remiss in not having gone back and read Bruce Gamble's book on that. Because Bruce Gamble, just for the sake of our readers, is really the guy when it comes to Rabaul and the history of this particular campaign, and I would highly recommend any of his books to any of our listeners. He's also just a great human being. But yeah, the Japanese do manage to get aircraft up in the air, and managed to get them up to altitude sufficient that they would have been able to ambush this force. But in a twist of events that we don't really understand, they don't come down on top of our attack force, even though they have 70 planes up in the air, which is a big cap.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, is that, they get, numbers vary, but like the average number is about 70 aircraft that they get up, and that's a hell of a lot of damn fighters. And they just hang out.
Yeah.
They're up at altitude. They're above the American aircraft. They have the altitude advantage, and they're just kind of
it's
watching it go down.
Yeah. And you got to wonder, did they not want to be down inside the envelope of their own AAA weapons, perhaps? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And bad me, I should know, right?
Well, but I mean, I don't think anybody knows. That's the thing. Is to your point, Bruce Gamble's book, his trilogy, of which I have over my left shoulder here, I searched through there, and Gamble doesn't have an answer. Like, he doesn't. He's like, I have no idea.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
and if the guy who wrote the trilogy on Rabaul, exactly,
if Bruce doesn't know, then okay, I'm not going to feel that bad. And probably the answer is somewhere in the Senshi Sosho series, and we just haven't translated it yet. So there you go.
I don't know.
Anyway.
So as the American formation neared their rollout altitudes, so you got to remember there's fighters, SBDs, and Avengers at that boom, 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 at that stair step. The AAA opens up, and this is, by all accounts, and that's just shore batteries, the anti-aircraft weaponry on the cruisers. They're starting to come to life.
Yeah.
This is a tremendous amount of anti-aircraft fire that is being thrown up. I mean, again, I liken this to a European city, maybe not to the level of Berlin or Schweinfurt, but there's a lot of friggin' anti-aircraft that's being thrown up here.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, this is not a healthy environment to be flying into, because again, there's a lot of automatic weapons here, and if you're coming down to altitude, it's going to be problematic. Furthermore, by this point in the war, I mean, Japanese anti-aircraft for their ships is never anything to write home about. But one of the interesting additions that this cruiser force gives them, as I'm just thinking about this off the top of my head, each one of these ships, except Chikuma, carries 8 5-inch AA guns. And so just the fact that they're in this harbor adds an additional nearly 50 5-inch ACAC weapons, and all of the 25 millimeter automatics that they have on these ships. Yeah, the Japanese themselves are freaking out at this point. They're trying to raise steam, which is a very lengthy process in any sort of a steam-driven warship. It's not like a gas turbine where you can just say, we need to go. That's not going to happen. But the volume of anti-aircraft fire that they can add to Rabaul's organic defenses is significant.
That's a lot of lead, and the Americans lose 2 fighters almost instantly. As soon as the AA pops up, boom, fighters are going down, and they're starting to go down with rapidity. We're starting to lose more and more the longer the aircraft are hanging up in the air.
Sure.
So at this point in the war, the SBD is still our main dive bomber. The SB-2C, the Helldiver, the Beast, as they call it, you're going to hear about that in a minute. It's starting to come into the fleet, but the Dauntless is still the hammer. She's still the hammer. And this attack is no different. The SBDs of VB-12 roll over and begin their drops from about 10,000 feet, which is not exceptionally high for a Dauntless, but it's high enough for a dive bomber. Saratoga's SBDs roll in groups of 2 and 3. And true to the orders given to Sherman by Halsey, the dive bombers literally split up, and there's 2 or 3 per cruiser, and they're attacking the cruisers individually in groups of 2s and 3s. The AA was thick and was walking into the SBDs as they're making their dives, as rear seat gunner Miles James relays to his pilot as he rides backwards. He says, quote, "They're on our left now. Now they're on our right. Hell, I give up. They're all around us."
Right. Yeah. That said, a dive bomber in its dive is an incredibly difficult target to hit. The vertical rate changes just play hell with any sort of fire control computer. Even though the Japanese Type 94 computer on all of these cruisers, for instance, is one of the better anti-aircraft fire control systems of the war. It's better than anything the British have got. But against a dive bomber, it is very, very difficult to hit that plane because of the vertical rate changes. Really, automatic weapons become the better weapon to go after a dive bomber and just try to spray down the target and get it, because you're going to have real problems hitting it with anything like a 5-inch.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what happens here, because the Dauntlesses are actually pretty accurate. You've talked about, the hit ratio for,
Yep.
it's piss poor.
Yeah. But with a dive bomber, you can typically get about 1 hit in 6, which doesn't sound great, but if you got a lot of dive bombers, it'll get the job done. That's historically what we got at Midway, and that won the battle.
And that's exactly what happens here. So on they're, as I said, they're pretty accurate on these attacks on these stationary targets. Cruiser Maya is smacked by a 1,000-pound bomb on her scout plane deck. This starts a tremendous fire that spread quickly to her engine room, causing over 130 casualties.
Yeah.
Is it Takao or Takao?
Takao.
Yeah. Takao. She's also hit on her main deck, just starboard of her number 2 turret. Seconds later, she's hit again on another turret. Atago, who was still refueling, was splattered with shrapnel from 3 1,000-pounders that killed the captain on the bridge. The man standing there, and he's sliced in half by shrapnel from one of these 1,000-pounders.
Yeah.
Mogami, who is a veteran cruiser.
Yes.
She's probably hit the hardest though here, right, John? I mean, she takes a beating.
No, she gets hit by one that goes right between her forward turrets and just basically flattens the area between those turrets. Does not get into her magazines, but the fires that are kicked up start to threaten the magazines, and so she's definitely in a world of hurt here too. And this, you say she's a veteran cruiser. This is not her first time at the races when it comes to being under dive bomber attack. She's weathered this sort of thing before and knows just how incredibly unpleasant it is.
Mm-hmm. She's flooded down by her bows, and her decks are damn near awash. She's only like 7 feet above the waterline when she's plunked down to flood her forward magazine.
Yeah, forward she's trimmed down. Yep.
Yeah. So the dive bombers of VB-12 do their job. They come in there, and this is a brand new unit. Keep this in mind. These aren't, the veterans of Scouting 6 at Midway,
right?
Or even or Eastern Solomons or Santa Cruz. These guys are green as grass, and they come in there and they waylay these cruisers, man. Dropping 22 bombs total. The SBDs from Saratoga heavily damaged 5 of the 6 cruisers in port with several near misses. Several other ships were hit.
What's the total hit count there? I'm just again trying to do the math in my head, but well, it helps to have stationary targets, but they got better than 1 in 6 out of this for sure. Anyway,
I'm saying several. So just the heavy cruisers, it looks like they took about 7 hits total.
That was what I was going to guess, 6 or 7. So they're doing they're doing 1 in 4 or better than that. So
well, that's not that's not even all. So 2 light cruisers and 2 destroyers are also hit too by bombs.
Right.
So I mean, these guys are friggin' accurate. To your point, these ships aren't moving, but who cares? Their job is to go in there and hit these things, and that's exactly what they do.
Yeah. Exactly.
God help the American torpedoes. Just when we think that things are starting to come to the surface, no pun intended here, that we're actually getting torpedoes that start to work, and we are on destroyers for the most part.
Yeah.
The TBFs that are coming in here from both Princeton and Sarah, they perform well. They make their runs, they do their thing, they drop their fish. Nothing happens.
Yeah.
If they hit the target, which is a big if, they're duds. So they're God bless their sacrifice, honest to Christ.
Right.
So the cap that we were talking about, that were orbiting above the attackers and failed to attack. Well, they attack now. So in my notes, I say egress under duress. So when these fighters when the Americans are getting out of Dodge, the Japanese fighters come down and they put a hurting on our people when they're getting out of there, right?
Yeah, correct.
So the sky is quickly a beehive of activity. And remember what I said, that the fighters that are coming in here, American fighters, these are F6F. So these ain't the old Wildcats. These are going to be hot new fighter. They do take some losses, but they do inflict some punishment on the Japanese. Doolittle Raider trainer Hank Miller is credited with dropping 2 of the Japanese fighters on the way out.
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy named John Magda from VF-12. He scores the highest of the day. This guy is a bad dude right here. Seriously, I'm going to lay it on you. On the way out, Magna shoots down a Zero that pulled directly in front of him. He dropped another one that appeared just to his right, pulling in behind it, pouring 50 caliber into the Japanese as the Japanese dove away on fire. A third Zero was blown out of the air when Magna slid in behind the Japanese as the enemy fighter drew a bead on a retiring SBD. The Zero pulled off the SBD. Magna stayed with him and watched him crash into the water. A fourth Zero shot from the tail of another Dauntless, and this Zero simply just blew up in his face. This made 4 for Magda in one day. While 4 in one day is an accomplishment for anybody,
yeah,
it is estimated that he shot these 4 down in less than 5 minutes.
Wow. Yeah. That's a hot day at the stick. So
yeah, he's getting his pay.
Gives you, and also gives you a sense for just the better performance of this particular airplane. This is honestly one of sort of the combat debuts of the Hellcat, and the Navy flyers who were flying this thing, some of whom certainly came up through Wildcats, are extremely impressed with this particular plane. Yeah, it may look kind of like a Wildcat, but it's a completely different beast under the hood, because it's got that 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney in there. This is a very, very hot airplane.
It's a coin flip, in my opinion, between it and the Corsair as being the finest propeller-driven aircraft of the Pacific Theater. I'm
a Corsair guy all the way.
I am too.
Yeah. Just because it's so cool looking. How can you not?
It is.
And it is a hotter fighter than the F6, but from a utilitarian standpoint, which was the better overall carrier fighter, I think you have to give the nod to the Hellcat. It was easier to fly. It was easier to land. It was a bigger plane, so it could take a little bit more punishment than a Corsair could. It's just a fine fighter.
Yeah. You mentioned Bruce Gamble. He called it the bent wing hot rod, talking about the Corsair.
The Corsair. Yeah, no, I love that plane. Don't get me wrong.
Absolutely. Hell yeah. So the guy we'd mentioned before, who the overall strike leader, Commander Caldwell, he's still orbiting above as his fighters, as his aircraft are getting the hell out of there. He's still orbiting above. His photographer's mate is snapping images, some of which you're going to see in this video.
Yeah.
It doesn't take the Japanese long to look up and go, hey,
yeah,
there's somebody up there.
Yeah, right. And they come after him, and the results are alarming. Shades here of what ended up happening to Burt Ernest's TBF during the Battle of Midway. It's a good thing that the TBF is a very beefy, robust airplane, because they just fill Caldwell's plane full of holes and turned into veritable Swiss cheese. And unfortunately, in the course of doing that, they kill Barnett, the photographer. Nail him with a machine gun.
It's pretty grisly. And, again, reading this out of Gamble's book, he says that the Saturday Evening Post at the time, this is reporting after the raid. Saturday Evening Post was one of the more family-friendly magazines of the era. They generally didn't go into a lot of gory detail. However, on this particular episode, they do. And they paid attention to this particular airplane and this particular crew. Caldwell's plane was attacked by 8 Japanese fighters, and he had an escort of 2 F-6Fs, and the 2 F-6Fs met the threat, but there were 8 against 2, and they wound up chasing these guys off. The 2 gunners in the Avenger are seriously wounded. Neither of them die, but they're seriously wounded. Barnett, however, is the one that receives the brunt of it, as you were saying. A Japanese fighter slides in behind Caldwell and opens fire. Japanese fire struck the photographer's mate Barnett in the back of the head. The 7.7 blew the back of Barnett's head off, and he fell forward over his camera dead. And this is all from the Saturday Evening Post. by the way, the family-friendly news magazine. The blood poured out of Barnett all over Caldwell, pouring onto his head and into his goggles, forcing Caldwell to remove his goggles so he could see. This is
ugly.
It's hideous. And the thing is, too, you think about these kind of gory aspects in ground warfare because they happen all the time.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily think about it in aerial combat, but yeah, human bodies don't react well to bullets.
Right.
And this is certainly one of those occasions. So, while the Flyboys had their share of glory, they had their fair share of gore as well. And this is one of those cases.
Yeah, for sure.
So out of ammo, apparently, the Zero that kills Barnett pulls up alongside of Caldwell and just peels off and goes away. Caldwell winds up landing back on the carrier. He has no flaps, no ailerons, no radio, and only one wheel down. Yet he still executes a perfect 3-wire landing on USS Saratoga.
Without flaps. I can't. Okay, so I clearly Caldwell knew how to fly. Wow. Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah, that is seriously impressive. The thing had over like 110 holes in it. I mean, it was Swiss cheese. It really was.
Yeah, just like Burner's plane as well. And again, a testament to the Grumman Iron Works that cranks these aircraft out, that they could, you think about what happens if you pump 110 machine gun holes into a Japanese Zero. That thing is shot down 5 times over. I mean, it's just, there's no way that it gets home. But yeah, these were big, beefy planes, and they could take a lot of punishment.
Yeah, and this is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
So Sherman and his Flyboys had accomplished a major victory here. This is nothing short of spectacular. It really is. They had achieved the surprise that they had wanted. They devastated the Japanese cruisers and the destroyers, which were actually secondary targets that they intended to hit. The neutralization of the cruisers by the carrier strike effectively eliminated the threat to the Bougainville beachhead. It didn't effectively eliminate it. It did eliminate it.
Right. Yeah, because basically all of these cruisers are going to have to be sent back to the shop at this point. Just in one blow, they completely took Kurita's force off the table.
Yeah, he didn't sink any, but you don't have to sink a ship to render it mission ineffective.
I was just going to say the word mission kill. That's what you wanted to do in this case. Is damage is as good as being sunk, because if we can just get these things out of the neighborhood, we're going to be able to invade successfully. We're going to have our own airfields, and these things are never going to be able to come back and bother us again.
And that's exactly what happens here. Halsey is over the moon when he hears about the results of the raid, which by the way are confirmed later on when Kenny's 5th Air Force actually does fly a mission over top of Simpson Harbor, and photographs are taken of these heavily damaged ships. He sends a message to Sherman, quote, "Report of attack is real music to me. When the Saratoga is given a chance, she is deadly. Princeton, too, takes a deep initial bow in the South Pacific. May the Jap cripples permanently be buried in Davy Jones's locker. A funeral dirge has been sounded for Tojo's strongest South Pacific base," end quote. Again, vintage Bill Halsey.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a reason that the newspapermen just loved him, because he always had something pithy and pugnacious coming out of his mouth. I mean, he's just a reporter's dream.
Great material here. So this raid emboldens Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who had, again, admittedly withheld forces from Halsey to augment his Central Pacific thrust against the Gilberts, which we'll talk about in another episode.
Yeah.
He says, "Hey, Bill, you and Sarah and Princeton did a really good job down there. How about we do it again?"
Right.
He sends the two first carriers of this Essex class, USS Essex CV-9 and Bunker Hill 17, that reach the Pacific. And this is not their debut, because they actually do a couple little hit and runs here and there, but this is their debut for major action here.
Mm-hmm.
And without getting into the weeds too much on Essex class, because we'll do that later on, these are the big girls that carry the hell. They're still in service some of them are still in the service in the 1980s, for crying out loud. This is the backbone of the United States Aircraft Carrier Task Forces from 1943 until, forever, damn near.
Right.
these are huge ships. They're not as big as Sarah, but they're close. 872 feet long. I call them the best aircraft carriers of the war. You said Tayo might have something to say about that, but
Yeah, well, yeah, you can make various arguments up and down. I would actually generally agree with you. There's always, of course, the ongoing debate between armored flight decks and unarmored flight decks, and
sure.
and the Essex does not have an armored flight deck. And as will be demonstrated in some of the later episodes when you talk about the kamikaze threat, or
Mhm.
having an armored flight deck can be a very useful thing. But the bottom line is that the U.S. Navy views its carriers as offensive assets, and armored flight decks incur big penalties in terms of the size of the air group that I can carry. And so they make the decision that they're going to really focus on the offensive side of the equation with the Essex class. And yeah, they're just fabulous ships for the kind of war that we're going to be fighting for the remainder of this conflict. Big, fast, carry very large air groups, in some cases up to 110 planes, and some typically around 100 is what they'll carry. Absolutely festooned with anti-aircraft weapons. 5-inch 38s, tons of Bofors. These are extremely formidable characters from a defensive standpoint as well.
Their anti-aircraft suite would make a cruiser blush, honestly.
Yeah. No, they're in the same league with a fast battleship. I mean, they carry a lot of boom boom. And of course, the fact that they have an organic air wing on them as well makes them extremely dangerous customers to come into contact with. And two, by this time in the war, our damage control is extremely good. If you look at the way that these ships are built from a firefighting standpoint, they have the ability to subdivide the hangars into multiple sections, each of which can be curtained off with water curtains. They've got extensive foam systems, the whole schmear. They're extremely battle damage resistant vessels. As the USS Franklin is going to demonstrate, as Bunker Hill will demonstrate later. Jesus, yeah. Anyway,
these are beasts, man. They really are. They're the cutting edge. So Bunker Hill was one. She was the newest carrier in the fleet that was deployed at this time. She carries one of the newest aircraft in the Navy's arsenal. We mentioned it before, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. The Helldiver eventually becomes a very good aircraft. However, at this stage in her career, she was much like Saratoga was, in that she was hated by the guys that flew the thing. They called it the Beast. They called it there's a bunch of different names. The most unforgiving nickname, which is my favorite, is SB-2C. They called it the son of a bitch second class, which is
not a term of affection. Yeah.
No, not at all.
Well, it is interesting that a lot of these carriers, fought tooth and nail to keep their Dauntlesses on board them as long as they possibly could, because a lot of the aviators have been hearing horror stories about the SB-2C that they just didn't want this plane.
Yeah. Lexington CV-16 and Enterprise CV-6 are the last two to give up their SPDs, and they're still flying them at Phil C in June of 44.
This is correct. Yeah. Yikes.
Yeah. So the second raid was nothing compared to the first, honestly. The opposition was relatively light, Japanese opposition, and the targets were not nearly as plentiful. No heavy war. Well, I shouldn't say no heavy warships. There weren't very many heavy warships in port. Some of the light cruisers and destroyers were there, as well as some transports. Despite the lack of ripe targets, the flyers attacked what they could and suffered through intense anti-aircraft fire that, again, was exceedingly accurate. On the way out, just like the first time, Japanese fighters pounced. The melee spread from St. George Channel to Blanche Bay, with fighters swarming all over the sky. That is a big area of sky.
Yeah.
VF-9 Hellcat driver Harry McWhorter claimed 3-0 shot down in a dogfight that lasted roughly 10 minutes, which is a long damn time for a dogfight.
Yeah.
Most of these are seconds. This is 10 minutes-ish. That's a hell of a long time. the Americans on the second raid send 275 aircraft to Rabaul. Again, to your point, the deck load strikes of the Essex-class carriers is mind-boggling.
Yeah, they can really send a lot of planes for sure.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, they can. Only one destroyer was sunk, however, while a light cruiser and 3 destroyers suffered minor damage. So less than stellar results.
Yeah, not in even remotely the same league in terms of war results, particularly because the first carrier raid had been so important in forestalling what was a dire threat to our beachhead at Bougainville. We're no longer in those sort of desperate straits. One of the ships hit here, just as an aside, was the light cruiser Agano, which is one of the most modern light cruisers in the Japanese Navy, and she actually has a pretty ugly end. She's damaged here kind of badly, limps back to truck, is patched up in an emergency sort of way, and gets underway to get back to Japan for permanent repairs. This is the middle of February, and those of our listeners who are, savvy about what's coming up here, she gets sunk by a submarine north of Truk, and 500 and some survivors get plucked out of the water by various Japanese warships who turn around, boogie back to Truk just in time to be caught by Operation Hailstone, which is the major carrier raid against Truk. And those ships, the rescue ships, end up getting sunk, and every man on Agano's crew is lost. So, the fact that she was damaged here in Simpsons Harbor really ends up putting it is her death knell, that her death warrant gets signed here in the harbor.
Kind of seals her fate. That's horrific when you think literally there are no survivors, none from a cruiser. That's a lot of dudes.
Yeah, she was a big ship. So
So the American reports from the second raid are nothing if not spectacular. However, the actual results are nowhere near. American reports stated that flyers from the aircraft carriers downed 37 enemy aircraft. The Japanese actually lose 11. Japanese claimed 71 American shot down when, as we know, the Americans only lose 9. So it's both sides. This is an exaggeration fest of biblical proportions.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's very anticlimactic. You send these 2 big old brand new, shiny new toys down there to go get their teeth cut. And while they do experience, they see the elephant, as I like to say, they see combat, and they do cut their teeth. They don't cut their teeth in the way that I guarantee you Admiral Nimitz was hoping and expecting that they would.
Yeah.
So one quick thing before we adjourn here. The Japanese, after this second carrier strike, and it's very clear to the Japanese that this is a carrier strike. The big blue United States Navy aircraft are very hard to miss. They know where these are coming from. They are burning with desire for revenge. The Japanese send out a pretty large counterstrike against the American aircraft carriers, the 2 Essex class here that we're talking about. Not Sarah, well, Sarah and Princeton are in this group, but the targets are going to be the Essex class carriers. At 1300 on the same day as the carrier raid, American radar screens picked up the flight of incoming enemy aircraft. Combat Air Patrol of F-6S from VF-17. I'm sorry, not VF-17 is Jolly Rogers. These are F-4Us from VF-17, my bad. And VF-33, these are F-6S, are vectored toward the threat as the Japanese drew closer. And John, this is something I know you wanted to talk about. American AAA opens up with a fury that the Japanese had never seen, and this includes Santa Cruz, had never seen anything like this before.
Yeah, we just unload on them. We talked about during the Santa Cruz episode just how powerful American anti-aircraft had become, even by the time you get to October of 1942. By the time you're talking the end of 1943, it has metastasized again into even more lethality, because among other things, we're starting to use the VT fuse on our 5-inch weapons, which is increasing the lethality of that weapon by a factor of, depending on who reports you read, between 5 and 7. The beautiful thing about a VT fuse is all you have to do is just fire that thing and get it within the neighborhood of your target, and it will take care of detonating and hitting that plane. So it's a much more lethal shell. And yeah, we're at this point, I would say we've entered now what I would call late war U.S. Navy AAA, in that the throw weight, just the sheer number of weapons that are on our ships, combined with the increased lethality of that 5-inch gun, is just, it's phenomenal. And yeah, these Japanese pilots have never seen anything like this, and this is the threat environment that they're going to have to live in for the rest of the war.
To your point, the Japanese send, oh geez Louise, American Combat Air Patrol and the AAA, most of which were shot down by the AAA, knocked down 17 of the 23 attacking Vals. All of the incoming Kate torpedo bombers are shot down, every single one.
Yeah.
Only 2 Japanese fighters were shot down, but regardless, the enemy attack had been wiped out before it could do any damage at all to the 2 big carriers in the task group.
And so what you're seeing here is, by the time you get to this point in the war, flying torpedo planes against enemy ships was always dangerous. By now, it's suicide. You just can't do it. Conventional torpedo attacks will not work against an American task force. You're just going to be killed. So yeah, it's pretty frightening stuff.
Yeah, it's just a harbinger of things to come for the Japanese when it comes to attacking a large, group of American warships.
Yeah.
There's always going to be 1 or 2 that get through, and there are some that get relatively close to Bunker Hill. I think they splatter her flight deck with some shrapnel from one of the bombs, but hits are very hard to come by. This is not Hornet being attacked at Santa Cruz here anymore.
Yeah, right. I mean, it used to be that if you would see an incoming raid of 30 or 40 enemy aircraft, that is really problematic, and you're likely going to take a number of hits from that. We've got a similar size attack here, and it just gets absolutely shellacked and does nothing. So the final results of these 2 raids: the first raid was a massive success. The second raid, while not scoring heavily on ships in the harbor, actually killed more Japanese pilots than did the first raid. So when you combine the 2 events together as a whole, the combined fleet loses, for a temporary time, several heavy cruisers to heavy damage. They lose a tremendous amount of still relatively experienced Japanese carrier pilots. Yeah,
because a lot of these guys are carrier pilots.
Yeah, and so for the sake of our audience here, one of the things that Admiral Koga had been doing throughout this time period, they're trying to rebuild their carrier air wings, but at the same time, since Rabaul is so important, they've been shuttling some of these fighter pilots down to Rabaul to augment the air defenses around that very important base. The result of this is that a lot of those carrier pilots have been killed in defense of Rabaul, which thereby sets back all of the efforts that Koga is trying to put together to rejuvenate these air wings. This is not going to stand them in good stead when we get into things like the Battle of Philippine Sea, which, remember, is only 6 months away.
Yeah. Of the fighters, half of the fighters that Koga sends down are lost. 85% of the dive bombers that Koga sends down are lost. 95% of the torpedo aircraft that Koga sends down are lost.
Right.
This is as you say, it guts the Japanese.
Yeah, this is very, very bad news from again, from the standpoint of you're already trying to play catch up to the American pilot training programs. You can't afford to be frittering away carrier aviators, frankly, in the defense of a land base that should be able to take care of itself.
Yep. And it puts a serious dent in any plans going forward here.
Yeah.
So, the capture of Bougainville is successful, obviously. The unsuccessful Japanese attempt to destroy both the fleet offshore and minishore, as well as the 2 carrier raids on Rabaul, forces Koga's hand. Never again would any major warships of any type ever enter Simpson Harbor again. So at this point, for all intents and purposes, the monster that is Rabaul, the monster in the closet, has been vanquished. I mean, it is essentially neutralized as the vaunted port that launched so much misery for the Americans and their allies from Guadalcanal to now. It's
no,
dead.
that's absolutely right. I mean, in a sense, you can see this as sort of the unintended culmination of Cartwheel. We've achieved the goal of Cartwheel insofar as nullifying Rabaul. It's never going to be captured because, again, just given the sheer size of the garrison there, the Americans look at this and are like, do I want to go into a battle against 100,000 dug-in Japanese in this place? No. Rabaul is going to be bypassed and will become its own backwater and one of the largest concentrations of Japanese troops outside of the home islands that's been, cut off and left to wither on the vine. But it is sort of amazing that when you think about Cartwheel as being really conceived of as a land-air campaign to put a ring of air bases on islands around Rabaul to neutralize it. And yet at the end of the day, you can make a certain argument that it was carrier air power that ends up doing what those land-based air. We didn't need the air bases in the final analysis, because if you could neutralize Rabaul as a port to the point that the Japanese aren't willing to send warships down there anymore, you've kind of accomplished your mission.
Yep. And again, as I said, it's the harbinger of things to come. The carrier air power that is just doing nothing but growing for the U.S. Navy is going to put a whipping on everything from here on out, all the way across the Pacific Ocean.
Yep.
John, do you have anything else you want to add in before we wrap her up? I
don't think so. This was a fun one. Again, a little sort of a, I don't want to say overlooked, but this is the last of Halsey's real desperation moments, and it is really kind of cool that he was able to solve his problems with just 2 aircraft carriers. Again, we think about the second naval battle of Guadalcanal, where 2 battleships pull his fat out of the fire, and here it's 2 aircraft carriers do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and it's vintage Halsey, from the decisions to the communications to everything. This is vintage William Halsey. This and Guadalcanal, frankly, were his finest moments, really, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's downhill from now.
Unfortunately,
yes.
As we'll see as we progress.
Yeah.
So with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We would appreciate it. Also, if you want to see the video version of this, tune into our YouTube channel and give us a like and subscribe there as well. If you have a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for watching. And for Bill, I'm going to say adios for Bill. John, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a good time.
Yep. And we'll see you again soon.
All right.